the Senate. Thank you all for coming. I just want to make one quick announcement before turning it over to Kate and the distinguished panel here. Oh, hello. Okay, this evening we have one more engineering event, an AI augmented reality scavenger hunt from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. right here in Levine. You can access it through the website www.upenn.edu/teachin. And you can access this augmented reality scavenger hunt through your mobile phones. So I just want to make this announcement. It's put together by our students and by our faculty right here in engineering. Thank you.
So it's my tremendous pleasure to open up this Teach-In event. My name is Kate Stebbe. I'm the Deputy Dean for Research and Innovation in the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. And I have a distinguished panel of colleagues, all from our wonderful Department of Bioengineering. And I think this is going to be a very natural ebb and flow of discussion because each of them is working on a technology to harness concepts to help society. And each of those concepts has related to it challenges, and because of the new possibilities made possible by the technologies that they use, ethical challenges as well. So it's a perfect topic for a teach-in. So for anyone who wants to pose a question, we're hoping that you'll go to this website, which just starts with the name GOO, how adorable, but gww.gl/slides/GNFGXU. And if you pose your questions there, then we'll have somebody who's helping pop them up on the screen and posing them to the panel, and I'll be moderating that discussion. So if you can get to that website and type your questions in there, that would be just wonderful. So by way of introduction, I wanted to introduce my panel members. And so we have the highly inventive David Isidore, who works on micro and nanotechnology, imaging, and diagnostics, but they'll have a chance to tell their own story in a moment. Jennifer Phillips-Cremins, who works on fascinating questions of topology and connectedness and epigenetics and development and function of our central nervous systems. And David Meany, who is not only a professor of bioengineering, is also the department chair, whose expertise is in neuroengineering and who's been focusing on traumatic brain injury. So with that as my way of introduction, I'm going to ask each of you in turn to discuss what is your work about, what is your area of expertise, and the discussion you wanted to frame for us here today. And the challenge is, I want each of you to take not much more than 3 minutes to do that. So Dave, we'll start with you.
Okay. I'm the guinea pig. My interest is in bringing medical diagnostics to the people. And so right now, if you get sick, they take blood, they take it to a lab here at Penn. There's a lot of manual processing steps to extract molecular information to figure out what's actually wrong with you. We're stealing a lot of technology. My background is from electrical engineering. We're stealing a lot of the same architectures we use to design computer chips to miniaturize and automate and integrate these very complex molecular processes onto microchips. And so we can take blood or spit or pee, whatever we can kind of scrape off of you, and put it onto one of these chips and do a very complex process, but it's all automated. And what we're finding with these chips is that we can extract a lot of information, and one of the big challenges we're facing now is how to make sense of all the information, how to apply advanced computational techniques to turn this information into useful information that clinicians can actually apply to make you healthier. So that's who I am.
Hi, everybody. I'm an assistant professor in bioengineering, as Dr. Stevie said, and my lab studies the development of the human brain. We want to really understand the code at the molecular level that dictates how cells begin sort of nondescript without a decided upon fate, and ultimately arranges into this complex, beautiful architectures of the tissues found in the human brain. And then by understanding that code, we can also determine how it goes bad during the onset of neurodegenerative disease, which is sort of a long-term goal and passion, personal intellectual fascination of mine and the people in my lab. Our sort of unique twist on understanding this problem is that we want to understand the topology of the DNA. So what does that mean? In every single one of your cells, there's over 3 billion letters of sequence. And if you were to take that information just out of one single neuron in your brain and stretch it out end to end, it would be roughly 6 feet 5 inches tall. I believe that's roughly the height of the average point guard in the NBA. And yet that specific sort of height of material that has to go into one cell has to be coiled into fascinating topologies that fit onto the head of a pin, which is essentially the size of the nucleus in that particular neuron. And so my lab has sort of been at the forefront of figuring out what those topologies actually look like by creating maps, and then determining how they change as cells kind of progress through the different stages of neural differentiation. And then some of our more recent work that I'm most excited about is that we're discovering that the topologies are massively disrupted in certain human brain disorders. And so why that's sort of relevant for the panel today is that we're quite obsessed at the moment of determining how to develop engineering strategies to engineer those topologies so that we can sort of take the genome in 3D and turn it back into the architectures that are present in the normal wild-type healthy state. And the hypothesis and the dream goal here is that eventually, if we can engineer the topology and get it back to where it began, that we could potentially reverse some of the phenotypes or the pathologies that are present in certain brain diseases.
Okay, good morning, everyone. My lab studies concussions. And concussions, as I think all of you know, are very much in the news nowadays. If you look at the statistics, for example, of how many concussions are diagnosed each year in the United States, if you took this statistic 5 years ago, the number would be about 1.5 million concussions. Today, in this past year, there were 5 million diagnosed concussions. So there's been a tremendous increase in the diagnosis of concussion, in part because I think we're all concerned about how even a single concussion affects the brain, not just moments after the concussion, but many years later. We hear about professional football players that soon after retirement, or maybe even while they're still playing, they're complaining of persisting impairments in brain function that get only worse with age. And there's a diagnosis called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is coined CTE, that is very much in the news because it has raised the awareness that maybe even a single concussion, or in some cases, a player who's played never having had a concussion but a series of subconcussive blows could develop this type of damage within the brain. So our lab has developed collaborations that extend out into different areas of engineering and science, as well as the clinic, and we're really interested in, number one, what happens to the brain in the moments after a concussion? Why do the circuits in the brain change in the way that they do? And how does the brain rewire itself over time after a concussion? Is there something that we can learn about the principles of that rewiring process that we could potentially accelerate in the future? Number two, we'd also like to know, is there any type of test we could administer to people that have had a concussion that tells us for that specific individual how they're doing in the rehab process after the concussion? Concussions are very individual injuries. The circumstances, the forces, the way in which your head strikes the surface, for instance, it's unique for every concussion. And that is very difficult to deal with. But we're learning how to deal with that using some testing, in fact, in collaboration with Dr. Isidore's lab. And finally, one of the things I'll talk about today is there anything that engineering in particular can do to help prevent concussions? For instance, when we look at football as a sport in this country, are there new technologies that we can incorporate into the helmets that are worn by players that actually reduce their risk of concussion? And I'll get into that in some of the later conversation.
Wonderful. So I think that as engineers, we're always constantly inspired by the idea that there's a new capability in science or a new capability in technology that we can harness for good. And so with that as a beginning starting point, for each of you, if you were to realize your wildest dreams of success, what is the impact you will have in society? So I want to tackle this as all of the beauty and good that can happen. And then you can guess that I'm foreshadowing that we might also talk about challenges. So let's start right now. And again, in the same order, if you guys don't mind, what is the dream impact? Like Dave, all of your technologies work. Dave Isidore to start. Your technologies work. What are some specific examples of those technologies? And how might they create good on Earth?
Yeah, so it's really easy. For me, the dream scenario is 30 years from now, there's no tuberculosis anywhere on Earth. And this is like a totally actually achievable goal. A lot of the diseases we work on cancer, we work on traumatic brain injury. These are diseases for which there exists no cure, or there exists no cures that work all the time. Tuberculosis, there's been a diagnostic and a cure for 50 years. But if you look at a map of where tuberculosis is, it's exactly where there's no money. So if you go to rural India, if you go to rural South Africa, if you go to rural Ghana, you find tuberculosis. So wherever there's no money, there's no access to medical resources, people have tuberculosis. And the world is finally, in many ways this is a moral failure, right? Because we have these technologies, but we haven't applied it. We haven't cared enough to actually solve this problem. And the world is finally being forced to care because now there are these emerging strains of the tuberculosis for which our existing drugs don't work. And the existing diagnostics are insufficient to identify who has these drug-resistant strains versus who has these regular strains. And so a lot of the work in my lab, we've done work in cancer and brain injury, and we have lots of interests. But for me, the tuberculosis is the one that, if I could do one thing with my life, would be to make a technology that allows the diagnosis of tuberculosis at a level sensitive, similar to what we do here at Penn, but that is accessible in these resource-limited settings. And I think this is actually a very achievable goal. It's obviously big, but I think technology actually has an opportunity to solve this problem. And the current level of this disease is enormous. Right now, about a third of the world has some level of infection of tuberculosis, and this is the #1 cause of death of people who have HIV. So it's not at a small level right now. It's at a very, very high level. So that would be the dream scenario. Would be no more tuberculosis.
Okay, great. Jen?
It's quite fun to step out on a 30-year timeline and couch something as a dream scenario, and that we all know that we all give our very best to play our part to advance a problem, but then we know that it requires a larger community of scientists in which we're all kind of building upon each other. So with that, I still will kind of venture out to say that my dream is to really uncover the molecular basis for neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's, but also ALS, Huntington's, Fragile X syndrome, another cohort of diseases that have a very different genetic basis. And then in the process of learning from nature how the mechanisms kind of progress for these diseases to take place, to ultimately develop technologies to reverse engineer not just the symptoms after it's too late, but actually reverse engineer prior to the symptoms ever happening, so that we can almost create preventative therapies. I think we all have been impacted by diseases such as Alzheimer's because the overall global population is living much longer. And what we're discovering is that through providing longevity through advances in medical technologies, we also have a new set of problems. And one of them is there's a massive exponential increase in people that are beginning to undergo cognitive decline later on in life. And this influences not only the individual, but also massive impact on families and personal well-being. And then in society, it's a massive problem in terms of financial issues that have to be sort of headed off. So if I could just, I guess, phrase it very briefly, it's that we would use our background in engineering to tackle neurodegenerative disease head-on. We would, as part of a community, uncover the mechanism for how these diseases actually take place. And then learning from nature, we would develop engineering strategies to reverse the problem before it ever becomes made manifest in the potential future patients.
Dave, vision 30 years out.
30 years out, I guess I'll be retired by then. But I guess my simple message is I'd like to put myself out of business. And what I mean by that is, as I said earlier, I study concussions. And if we could eradicate the effects of concussion in all of us, I'd put myself out of business, but I'd be pretty happy out of business if that occurred. I think it's going to occur in different ways. I think, for instance, the technology of protecting ourselves using the right equipment, I think that's going to go through a wholesale change in the next decade, probably even in the next 5 years. I think we're also going to understand much more about what happens during a concussion and following, and we're going to be able to identify people who, in the days after their concussion, are the ones most likely to have problems 6 months out. That's the problem that we have clinically now. For every 100 concussions that come into the emergency room, we know that about 20 of those people will have problems 6 months out, but we don't know which 20. And if we knew, even after the first week, which 20, we could really target our existing therapies for those people. So I'd like to put myself out of business.
That goes with the retirement plan.
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. So now I have one more question I'm going to pose before I open it up to all of you. So that question is, as these capabilities develop, what tools do you use, or what information is being amassed that gives you pause, that makes you think about the ethical challenges, and what is your philosophy for mitigating them? And on my way in to work, I was listening to discussions of data, and we all click on agree, and then we should have known we'd agreed. And do you know what you agreed to, et cetera? Okay, so with that sort of as opening, that we live in this world where all over the space, technologies come with them challenges, tools, structures, information, challenges, and how you see you have to thread it. So Dave, we'll go in this order.
Oh, and
I think
3 minutes, right?
yeah, 3 minutes.
Very good, very good.
But we can double back.
Yeah, so it's a really good question. But so the obvious ones for us are that, in our field, we're getting better and better and better at extracting personal medical information about ourselves. We can extract molecular information at every year, higher and higher bandwidth of information coming out of our bodies. And one really important question is, one, who owns that information, and two, what do we do with that information? And one of the hallmark, very interesting studies in my field has been that they did a study of men who were screened for PSA, prostate-specific antigen, and men who weren't. And it turned out the men who weren't screened had better health outcomes. And this is because if you live long enough and you're a man, you will get prostate cancer. It's sort of somewhat inevitable. And many of these prostate cancers are totally fine. By the time they grew big enough to actually cause a problem, you would have already died of heart disease or something else. But when people heard, oh, I have cancer, they go in and get chemotherapy and radiation, and if you're in your 70s and you do this can be quite damaging. So we have a really challenging issue about how do we handle this information? Is it safe to give this information directly to patients? Do patients have a right to have this information, if it's safe or not? If doctors have it, under what cases can doctors share it with your insurance company or with your employer? So there are serious issues related to what we're going to do with this information. And honestly, no one has a good answer. On my end, I think I have a few. I don't have answers, but I have some ideas. And I think one of the big ideas is that raw information is particularly useless. If you extract, you have this protein in your blood, or this, this circulating DNA in your blood, most people aren't going to be able to interact directly with that information. And what we're going to have to develop as the field moves forward are computational tools that can collect everyone's information and tie them to actionable items. You're eating way too much fish. Stop doing that. Something that you can actually do something about. Or go see a doctor. You have a blockage in your heart. Something that is actionable. But as a society, we're going to have to learn how to use this information, and we're going to have to choose whether we want to do it or not. I think that's one of the big, sort of problems we have is that we somewhat expect technology to solve all of our problems. We want, and which for a good reason. We've had a lot of good success stories of technology stepping in and making the world a better place. But more isn't always better, and we have to be somewhat judicious about where we want these technologies in our lives and where we maybe don't want them in our lives. And we need to be able to have that conversation without falling into the trap of this sort of optimism that a lot of people in our field are guilty of. If we stand up here and we give TED Talks and we wear black turtlenecks and tell you that how the future is going to be better, but technology doesn't always make the world better. Sometimes Facebook helps swing elections this way or that way, and so we have to be really careful and really thoughtful, and not always. We don't always have to be salesmen for what we're making. We have to be intellectuals. We're at a university. It's our job to show some leadership about what we think is the right technology.
So I turned up my collar.
Yeah.
Jennifer.
Nice. Well, I left my black turtleneck at home, but I still do want to talk about two things, and these are the issues that I'm actually most excited about, and then they also raise controversial ethical issues that I think will keep all of the people in this room in the job market for quite some time. My field has undergone sort of an explosion over the last maybe 5 years or so because of two key technologies. The first is deep sequencing, and to boil it down to just the most straightforward explanation is that we now have the ability in a very quick and also inexpensive way to sequence everyone's genome, to understand genome-wide all 3 billion letters, the base pairs of your DNA. And then there are a very large consortium, with 23andMe being the largest, with upwards of a predicted 10 million people, in which we will have databases of everyone's genetic information. Now, as a scientist, this has sort of springboarded the field is beginning to move so fast, because very large big data studies are now going on right now, in which there's a large cohort of genetic modifications that have been statistically strongly correlated with specific diseases. So in just a very few number of years, across many, many debilitating diseases, we have potential genetic targets. But that information comes with ethical questions. For example, who owns the data? Do you own it because you are the person who is being sequenced? Does the government own it? Does the company who sequenced you own it? And do they deserve to profit off of it by selling that information to other companies who want to develop drugs? Do you have the right to waive the ability of other companies to access your information? How much should healthcare providers get involved in knowing what diseases you are susceptible to potentially have? As the majority of the population has not gone through 30 years of rigorous academic training, most genetic susceptibility studies are just probability outcomes. And so if you don't think probabilistically and you see an outcome and then you take immediate action without the intervention of a trained medical professional to tell you that the probability is still very low, and to actually give you a wise guidance in terms of how you should navigate what you see, this could also raise tremendous alarms. How much should the FDA regulate? How much you as a patient should be able to see about your own data without the intervention of a medical professional who can sort of help you navigate the severity of the problem? These are all serious questions and are now at the forefront because as scientists, we're using the data to move forward the science. But at the same time, that data is now there in upwards of, currently now maybe 1 to 2 million possible people sequenced. It's going to exponentially grow over the next coming years. And so we do have to solve those problems to determine who owns the data and what we do with it. The second technology that has really transformed this field, and it's only been in the last 5 years or so, is CRISPR-Cas9 genome editing, where now we're now able to do what scientists have dreamed of, which is in a simple and very quick way, go to any location in the genome and edit it at will to change it. And this has given us amazing ability to do things that we always wanted to do. For example, in my case, we can now build systems to go to specific locations in the genome and engineer topology at will. Or you can imagine this could be sort of raising major ethical questions. If one can go in and take a mutation that leads to disease and modify it and reverse it, when should one do that? What is the severity of the disease that requires intervention? Should we only do this somatically in the individual who has the disease after they're an adult? Should we even consider, as a worldwide community, the possibility of engineering designer humans by intervening in the germline? Even if we could, in extreme cases of someone with a disease, intervene in the germline, should we? Because we're actually doing ectopic evolution on a timescale that goes from millions of years down to 1 year? What will that do to modify the human population? How severe is the disease when we should intervene? These are all questions that prior to about 5 years ago, that we really didn't even have to have the discussion because the technology wasn't there. But now it is. And so in the lab, it's amazing because we can do things we never dreamed of. But right away, there needs to be a discussion at the highest levels because the science is moving faster than the legislating bodies. So there's not really a strong architecture in place for people to govern who is allowed to go into the germline and start to engineer designer humans. Who's legislating that? Right now, the community came together and said there's a moratorium on these types of things, but countries such as China, they're pushing forward. So I think all of these issues as a whole, it's like with the technology comes also tremendous responsibility to start thinking about how these issues could affect society.
I gave her some of the time I had for introductions
Took it.
because I find it so fascinating. So I hope we'll all follow up on that one. David, the challenges and ethical issues that you see facing your field.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges, and it's not just for my particular area, but it's more broadly, it has to do with choice. And what I mean by that is, as we learn more about ourselves, and if we know, for instance, that we have a genetic makeup that makes us vulnerable to a certain disease, or in my research, if it makes a person vulnerable to a concussion, what choice do we make for that individual versus what choices does that individual make themselves? So let me give you a particular scenario. Let's imagine that we find some genetic fingerprint that increases a person's likelihood or vulnerability to a concussion by 5 times the normal individual. Do we simply communicate that to the individual and let them decide how they live their life? Do we restrict the activities that they experience over their lifespan? Do we prevent them from playing high school football, for instance? Or if they're a female, do we prevent them from playing high school soccer because of this susceptibility? And who makes that choice? In our society, we're very much an individualistic society when it comes to choice. But I can tell you, there are some choices that are made for individuals when you consider the medical risk that's involved. One example that comes out is it turns out that it's a well-known risk factor in a person's cervical spine, their neck, that if they have a particular geometry and they're playing football, they have a very high likelihood of suffering a cervical spine injury, catastrophic injury, paralysis. And those people are informed of that medical condition, and they're given the choice of whether they want to continue playing or not. But they're not screened on a regular basis for this. It's only when they have their first stinger in a football game do they get this kind of medical evaluation. So I think for us, and it's not just within the problem that I study, but I think more broadly in biomedicine, as we learn more about ourselves, where does that choice remain or reside? Within us or across society?
So with this now, we're going to open up the floor for questions. And I think before I do that, I'm going to let's applaud these guys, because I think they set the stage wonderfully. And then Vijay is going to help pose the questions that are coming in on the feed. So you guys, the question is, are you hoping to make these medical diagnostic technologies available to people within their homes? Is it possible to make these into take-home testing kits, perhaps with urine or saliva? So I think that's probably for you.
Yeah. So I think that's, so first of all, that already exists. And people who have diabetes, their lives are much, much better than they would have been in the 1950s because they can test their glucose. And so we already do have tests. Pregnancy tests are wonderful and are available. So these tests already do somewhat exist. And yeah, one of the goals is that, as we get better and better making these types of microchips, is that more medical testing can be brought into people's homes. And so that's going to happen, but it comes with all the challenges we talked about before, which is that, information isn't necessarily harmless. And so as we give people access to more information about, themselves and about diseases developing within their body, we have to, think about the safety of that and make sure they're given the proper tools to make it, useful and safe. The one thing I'll add to it is that one challenge we have in medicine, and one challenge we have here at the university when we think about impact in medicine, is that we're very tied to the business of medicine, right? And medicine is like really big business. There's tons of money in it. When we think about things we're going to do that are impact, things that are going to get from our labs out into the world, and we can start companies, they tend to have to make money and sort of work in this business environment. Medicine is one of the only fields where, as you add more technology to it, things don't get cheaper. Things get actually more expensive. So as we think of this kind of home testing, one critical aspect of this is how can we leverage this technology in ways to dramatically lower the cost of medicine, and not how can we create new markets and create new ways of sort of charging more, but how can we make new ways of charging less? And so we really have to think about that hard and show leadership there, because if we just want to have impact, we're sort of the evil capitalists will use us to their own end, and we have to be careful. And so that kind of feeds into that.
Terrific. Do you believe that the Hippocratic Oath extends to the modification of genes? If we have the ability to prevent diseases or decrease likelihood of their expression, does it fall on doctors/researchers to do this for someone?
Yeah. This is a question that I grapple with on a daily basis. So certainly I'm not an MD, but I am one of the scientists that's trying to work on technologies that will one day be used in the clinic. And I think we have to tread lightly because we're on very serious ground. On one side of sort of the equation, which is the conservative side, one could say that in no way should we ever consider modifying humans against nature's naturally evolved processes. And we should only use these new tools to only further research and further our knowledge, but we should not intervene. And the proponents of that side might say that there are extremely dangerous consequences of manipulating human evolution, and we don't know the actual outcome of what's going to happen. And of course, you've all seen these crazy movies in which the visionaries might predict what could happen if suddenly people could evolve to have traits to take over the world. The other side of the coin is, I think it comes to a more personal level. If you have the ability to intervene and you are looking in the eye of a person that just had a baby with a severe genetic defect in which you know you can do something about it, are you actually morally obligated to intervene because you have the tools? And I think there are strong proponents on both sides. And at this point, what is most important is that we raise the conversation and get all of the leaders in the field involved. And so in the beginning of 2015, one of the discoverers of CRISPR technology, Jennifer Doudna, and many others working in the field gathered to provide a forum in which they raised the conversation. And they published an essay in Science essentially calling a moratorium on any use of CRISPR in the human germline. And so for now, what scientists are doing in the clinic is that they're focusing the technology on monogenic single mutation disorders that are in adult people. So they've arisen somatically, and one example would be sickle cell disease, in which you know the mutation, you know you need to fix it, you take out the blood cells, you manipulate them in the lab, and then you put them back in that human, and it assists that human, it could heal that human, but it doesn't necessarily pass on to future generations. And I think where people are at the current time is that somatic intervention of single genetic disorders is a home run. The only risk is that we have to worry about off-target effects, we have to worry about safety profiles, we have to worry about unintended consequences of fixing the mutation. But those are all studies that careful scientists can most definitely do. But ethically, I think the standing is like, we must do this. Issues of human germline intervention are far more pervasive, and I think should involve across many different expertise areas, because it's not just as simple as should you intervene in the face of a disorder. It's that, do we have a right to get involved in human evolution, and then how severe is a disorder to warrant changing things? Is deafness a severe debilitating disorder, or is it actually a good trait? Is Down syndrome a debilitating disorder, or does it actually provide tremendous joy to families? Autism has the same argument. So these types of questions are extremely complicated, and I think the thing is we all just need to step into a leadership role to engage in a conversation And for that reason, the CRISPR community has sort of said universally, we're calling a moratorium on doing anything in the germline at the current time until we have a better understanding of safety profiles and that we've fully vetted the ethical considerations.
Jen, I'm going to ask you to define two things, somatic
Sure.
and germline.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. So germline is probably the most straightforward, and that would be that we get involved right at the stage when the sperm meets the egg, and it's becoming the single cell, the 2-cell, 4-cell stage blastocyst. Right before you implant in the woman's uterus, you edit the genome so that every cell in the body for that little individual has been permanently modified. Not only is it permanently modified, but it can be passed on to subsequent generations. In that case, it's in the germline in that it can be further passed on forever. It is forever mutated. By contrast to that, somatic mutation is essentially that it only occurs perhaps in an adult in only one type of cell in your body, for example, your blood. In that case, if you intervened, you're intervening somatically only in those cells, but your blood cells aren't passed on to the next generation. That's coming through your germline. And so it's not a permanent modification to your entire being that can be passed on. It's only a modification to one cell type in your body as an adult, which could be causing a specific disease.
Thank you, that clarification was great. So now we have one for you, Dave, Mini. Are sports leagues aware of the research on concussions and the impact on the individual players, short and long term? And do they care?
They care a great deal, and they are aware. There's been enormous change in all of the leagues, all of the youth leagues, going from age 8, 9, all the way up into the high schools, and of course in college and professionals. So one of the things that we see in sports is that typically change occurs first at the professional ranks. There's reasons for that. One is that they have an ability to do that. They have the resources, the means to do that, and then it slowly filters down over time. To get ahead of the curve a little bit, there have been a number of youth leagues for contact football, for instance, that have eliminated contact. You play flag football until you're age 10 or age 12, and only at that point do you then transition into tackle football. And even then, they're changing the game so that they're eliminating some of the plays, for instance, the kickoff, where players run down at high velocity and they can collide and risk injury. They're eliminating some of the plays that are high risk. So the game is changing at the youth league first instead of at the professional league. But it's changing because parents are frankly concerned that they're putting their child in some harmful environment, the extent of which they don't know right now. So they're a little afraid of that. And I think that's a good thing. I think that's parents being cautious, and that's been a change for the good that hasn't taken decades. It's only taken years for it to happen. At the professional level, the changes have, in the game itself, been a bit more subtle, but nevertheless, there have been changes. What they're doing is they're really creating changes in the technology. They're first evaluating whether any technology is going to be effective for achieving the purpose that it intends to achieve, whether it's footwear and to reduce ankle sprains, or if it's a helmet to reduce concussion. Number two, they're informing players of what this equipment can do for them. And they're being very open about this, not just with players, but with manufacturers. And they're trying to provide manufacturers with the most advanced science possible so that they can move forward with new designs. And the National Football League in particular has been leading the way for that. So there has been change throughout. The change itself, though, has been a little different. But nevertheless, there's been change.
Do you anticipate regulation in the form of a lemon law or warranty being developed for software for an individual's personal data?
Dave, why don't you take that one?
And then wait, there are two key words here. Theranos,
Yeah.
Facebook.
Yeah. So this is all very. So Theranos is a fun topic because everyone's going to go to jail, or they should go to jail. And maybe Facebook, some people are maybe go to jail too. Probably not though. So, personal data obviously touches on all of these topics where, our genetic code, our genetics that make us more susceptible to certain injuries, the types of technology I'm working on that can extract more of our molecular information. And at some point, in every single field, every one of our fields becomes a data field. It becomes about, how do we manage our data, what legal structures have to form around our data, and everything is kind of, I think, converging to that. And so, the short answer is I don't have an answer, and I think it's partially because I wasn't trained right. I think engineers, in my training, I had to take like one microeconomics class, and I took one philosophy class, and mainly I know how to build things. And most of the way we train engineers is we mainly say, this is how you execute to build this item. And we don't teach enough on, should you execute, and how does this, fit into the larger context. Because what Jennifer was saying, if you look at, Congress and the people who are in charge of running our government, most of them are not suitably educated in science and engineering to make good decisions about how these technologies should be integrated into society. So you always have these issues where new technologies have unintended consequences. People who started Facebook didn't really think about elections until this last election. And Theranos is an example of what happens when Silicon Valley and the mentality of Silicon Valley that we're going to really, really fast, and we're going to fake it until we make it, and we're going to tell a really good story. We're going to use it to raise tons and tons of money, and once we have the money, we'll figure out the technology stuff later. What happens when you do that not in computer science, but you now do this in a field where you can actually promise things that are fundamentally impossible. What Theranos was arguing they could do, diagnosing cancer with a finger prick of blood, no amount of money was going to make that possible. There aren't enough molecules in the blood. There's not enough, the information is not there. And so what they were claiming to do was never going to work, and many people knew that, and it didn't matter because the story was exciting, the money was being raised, the assumption was something good would come of it, and of course nothing good came of it. So the short answer is that I think in general we have to train more engineers to think about these types of problems, and we have to train more people who are going to be not engineers, people who are going to be governors and presidents and Congress people. They have to, when they come out of Penn, they have to be educated enough that they can think about these topics and form legislation and form regulation, and when they run their businesses or operating as lawyers, that they can think about these things intelligently. And so I think it's ultimately a question of, the best solution I think is education.
So this is what really, we could throw this out to any of the three of you. So get ready to catch. What are your ideas about how to expand outreach to the K-12 environment to prepare future generations to become more scientifically literate and to prepare ourselves for the booming STEM job market? And this comes from Jacqueline Sarnes. This person was not anonymous, we have a name. So what are we doing? What are your ideas about expanding to K through 12 and preparing us with scientific literacy?
I guess I could throw out two ideas along somewhat different axes, if you will. The first is, we've spent some time today talking about ethical considerations as technology is created, as it's used. And when we talk about the STEM fields, math, science, and the engineering fields, I don't think we do enough in the K through 12 grades to talk about the ethical consequences or the discussions around what if you could do X? How would we decide whether to do X? I think we need to start having those conversations in the K through 12 grades. I see students that come to college that are really excited about the possibilities in engineering or across all fields of engineering, and are only beginning to appreciate the different dimensions that are the social dimensions. What if we were to create and deploy this particular technology? What would society do? What are the questions? We need to have our kids thinking about that at a much earlier age. Number two, I think these fields are highly participatory, so that if we don't provide them with some type of accessible, if you will, experiments or demonstration kits to show them what is possible in the STEM fields, we can't get them excited about the STEM fields. there used to be, when I was growing up, this fad where you would get a chemistry set, you would get an electronics set, you would get all different sets as a kid for Christmas. And at least for me personally, that was part of my development as becoming an engineer. What are those kits nowadays, and what's going on at universities that could become the kits of tomorrow that we then ship out? There's a faculty member at Stanford University that about 5 years ago created a way to make a microscope out of paper and a simple plastic lens. And you can buy it for about $1. It's something that gives you, I think it's 400 times the magnification, or maybe 1,000 times the magnification that's possible with the human eye. And he sends these out to low resource countries. India is one of them. And people go out and explore the world around them through this microscope. That's making technology that we use, microscopes, accessible to everyone. How many people has he inspired? He's shipped, I think, 5 million of these units in the past 5 years. Those are the kinds of creations that I think can really make a change for people that are out there interested but really don't know entirely what this is.
Jen, I'm going to ask you to follow up because I think about the broadening participation.
Sure.
So what inspires you, and what do you think can work, and how can we reach out there and do more?
Yeah, I've been inspired by 2 colleagues that are in our own department, so I'd like to very briefly highlight their work. I agree with Dave that the issue is one of exposure. I think as a very young child, I already loved science and math so much, but I simply just did not know about all of the different types of research going on. And even my own personal intellectual fascinations didn't come till a little bit later in life, simply too because I didn't intersect with the topic until a little bit later. So how do we address this issue of exposure and get all these available opportunities out across different people groups, across socioeconomic boundaries? So there are no boundaries, socioeconomic boundaries. And one example would be Arjun Raj's group in our department, of which his passion is science communication. And he's funded through the NSF through a career award to create these things called Sparks. And what they are is very simple. He finds that scientific journals have arcane language that is completely inaccessible to the public. People who are very excited to learn, but they don't have 30 years of time to learn a whole new jargon of language, but they're very intelligent. And so he wants to create online videos that basically sum up findings from papers, but in language that is actually accessible to the people that are reading them. I think that if he, could carve out even more time from his busy schedule to really push on that, it would be an incredible resource to attracting people across many different backgrounds into our particular area of research. The other idea is coming from my colleague Danny Bessette, and what she does is sort of integrates sort of examples from her field of network science and data science, and she goes into the community in as low as daycares, so across age groups, and has like modules that are very age specific to just introduce concepts of networks, of data science, integrating with the community in a way that they're building network models. And I think just the exposure of saying this is a field and alerting people across age groups that it actually exists can go a really long way. You never know who's in that little group that you're leading who might be a next generation sort of future leader in an upcoming area.
I have to conclude, and I just want to stay and keep listening. I told you I have wonderful colleagues, and so can you please join me in thanking them once again? Thank you, guys. The next teaching is in 5 minutes, so we've got to skedaddle. You've got to stay. And thank you so much for being here.
Welcome you to this teach-in, this panel on the future of technology, AI, and society. So I'd like to welcome you. There's been a lot in the news about how algorithms, artificial intelligence, are being used in decision making and some of the issues that are involved there. So some people think it's like taking over the world, but it is contributing to the price of goods and services. It's affecting decisions like whether people are hired, whether they get loans, and many other important decisions, what ads you're served up when you're surfing the web. So the concern is that while humans juggle societal issues like fairness and individual privacy of individuals, the question is, how can this happen as well in algorithms? How can algorithms be crafted so that they also address these social norms? Our panelists today are going to address what this really means, what the issue of fairness and privacy of individuals means in the context of algorithms, and how we can make artificial intelligence algorithms better behaved with respect to these social norms. So let me start out by introducing our panelists. These are all from the Warren Center for Network and Data Science. Dr. Michael Kearns on our left. He's a professor in the Computer Information Science Department in the School of Engineering, where he holds a National Center chair. He also has secondary appointments in economics, statistics, and operations, information, and decisions in the Wharton School. His research interests include machine learning, algorithmic game theory, computational social science, and algorithmic training. He's the founding director of the Warren Center for Network and Data Science, and he's worked and consulted extensively within the technology and finance industries. Sitting in the middle is Professor Aaron Roth. He's also in the Department of Computer and Information Science in the School of Engineering, where he's the 1940 bicentennial term associate professor. He's the co-director of the Networked and Social Systems Engineering program, undergraduate program at Penn, also affectionately known as NETS. It's a very popular program. He's associated with the Warren Center for Network and Data Science, and his research focuses on the algorithmic foundations of data privacy, algorithmic fairness, game theory and mechanism design, learning theory, and topics at the intersection of these fields. And on your far left is Professor Rakesh Vora, who is the George and Lydia Weiss University Professor of Electrical and Systems Engineering in the School of Engineering, and also in economics in the Wharton School. He's the co-director of the Warren Center for Network and Data Science and is a leading expert in mechanism design, an area of game theory that brings together economics, engineering, and computer science. So this is who our panelists are and what we're about. I think we have a highly qualified group of individuals to discuss the topics today. The way that we're going to manage this panel is I'll start by asking a question or two, getting the ball rolling. But after that, I would love to get questions from the audience that you think of. You can text them, or you can use the goo.gl/slides.jnfgxu link to either text or use another device that you have to send questions. And our Dean Vijay Kumar is going to be looking through those questions as we go along. So we have a broad participation in this particular panel. So that being said, I'll start by asking a question of the panel that may be in your minds as well. This has all been in the news, many examples in the news, but I'd like to hear from each of you your favorite example of algorithmic lack of fairness that's been around.
My favorite example of algorithmic discrimination.
Yes, your favorite example.
I guess for me, one of the most compelling ones was a well-known experiment that was conducted by a Harvard researcher named LaTanya Sweeney a few years back, who deliberately created a bunch of fake Google accounts and populated them with different activities so that some sort of personalization or profile would be built up. And did so in an identical way for all of these different fake accounts, So the only differences between these accounts were some of them were given names that are traditionally African American, and some of them were given names that were traditionally white Anglo-Saxon. And so, you would think that perhaps the search results and ads that were shown to these different accounts should be identical, since the only difference between them are the names. But lo and behold, in fact, you started seeing very different ads in the African American accounts than the non-African American accounts, in ways that you can go read about that are, sort of blatantly discriminatory. And what I like about this bad example is that it's complicated, right? So first of all, I think one of the themes that perhaps we'll discuss is that these kinds of discriminations can enter through the machine learning process without there being any specific evil intent by engineers or programmers anywhere in the pipeline. And also it highlights kind of the complicity, not just of, let's say, Google in this case, in the way that they design and manage their algorithms, but in advertisers as well, because of course, a major component of what ads you see on a service like Google or Facebook is not just how appropriate they think the content or ad is for you, but also what advertisers are willing to bid for the demographic profile that they think they're getting for a user. So it could be, for instance, that even though the algorithm is not discriminatory, it could be if the advertisers basically, if there's a particular group of advertisers that is more interested in the attention or eyeballs of an African American user base, they're willing to pay higher prices for their ads to be shown to that group. And so the bias can creep in that way as well.
So one of my favorite examples that you might have read about, because it was in the news within the last year, is the COMPAS recidivism prediction algorithm. So some of the applications of machine learning that you mentioned, like lending and hiring, these are pretty high stakes, but it turns out we use machine learning these days also to inform who spends time in prison. So the recidivism prediction algorithm made by this company called Northpoint, what it was trying to do was to predict whether an inmate, if released early on parole, would go on to commit another crime. And these kinds of predictions were given to parole boards to inform their decisions about who should be released. So ProPublica, an investigative news organization, did a study of this algorithm and how it was used in Florida, and found that when you looked at what was called the false positive rate, and the false negative rate, so this is if I look at the inmates that when they were actually released did not actually go on to commit additional crimes, but were incorrectly labeled by the algorithm as likely to commit additional crimes, the false positive rate was substantially higher on the African American population than on the white population. And I just want to emphasize, this is not about, this statement is not about base rates. It's not about which population, in fact, actually, goes on to commit more crimes. It's about how the mistakes that the algorithm makes are distributed. And sort of the finding of ProPublica was that the algorithm was disproportionately concentrating its mistakes on the African American population. And again, like Michael said, this is an interesting example because by all accounts, the sort of process by which Northpoint went about designing this algorithm was reasonable. At no point did they, did a human being consciously, decide that they wanted to design an algorithm that had any discriminatory properties. This was sort of an emergent behavior when you combined, a standard machine learning algorithm and a data set.
How does the algorithm acquire the bias?
That's a good question. I don't know if...
Let me repeat the question. How does the algorithm acquire the bias?
So should I answer or should we?
Please, yes.
So that's a big question, and I don't know the answer in this specific case, but there's lots of ways in which this can happen. So here's one simple reason. In machine learning, we have to try to fit simple rules to complicated data. Right? If you try to fit complicated rules, you end up tricking yourself into thinking you've learned when you haven't really. So you end up, memorizing the sort of labels in your data, but not in a way that is helpful for making predictions on new data. So because we want to make predictions, we have to fit rules that are simpler than the data is. So as a result, we have to settle for algorithms that are going to make mistakes. Now, when you've got two different populations that have different statistical properties, you've got a majority population, say, and a minority population, there's more bang for your buck if you're the algorithm and you're told something seemingly reasonable, like let's just minimize on average the number of mistakes we make, right? You've got more bang for your buck to fit the statistical properties of the majority population, because more of the people you encounter come from the majority population. So if you've designed your rule to do well on the one population, your average error will be lower than if you've tailored your rule for the smaller population. The problem is when you've got two populations that look different in any way, the rule that is good at making decisions for the majority population will be less good at making decisions for the minority population. So, so this comes from doing an, extremely reasonable sounding thing, find the simple rule that minimizes error, on this data set. It's naturally gonna, if it wants to minimize its average error, fit the bigger population, but in high-stakes settings, this has negative implications if you happen to be a member of the population that was fit less well.
So if you design your bridge using AI, you're going to wind up with cracks in the concrete, and then they collapse, and that's how you learn and improve your algorithm. Is that it?
Well,
Let me well, either have to repeat the question, or could we finish with the third exemplar and then perhaps move back to this question? So, Rick.
So the example I'll offer will echo some of the things that both Aaron and Michael mentioned, and the other reason I'll offer it is because it's an old one. The story begins in the mid-1970s at St. George's Medical School in the UK. They admit roughly on the order of 150 to 200 medical students a year at that time. They receive about 12 applications per position. So remember, we're talking about the mid-1970s. There's no computer necessarily on everyone's desk to help them process applications. A member of the medical staff says, why don't we build an algorithm to decide which candidates to bring in for interview? There are two reasons to do this. It will make us more systematic, and it will save us time. So over 5 years, an algorithm was developed, continuously tested. By about the 5th year, it was discovered there was about a 99% match between the Human Selection Committee and the algorithm, meaning 99% of all applicants run through either the algorithm or the Human Selection Committee will receive the same decision, which is either come for an interview or not. By the early 1980s, the committee disbanded and said, well, in that case, why don't we just use the algorithm? And for 6 years, the algorithm was used to decide which candidates were brought in for interview. By the mid-1980s, the UK Commission on Racial Equality was asked to investigate. Their statisticians concluded that the algorithm was biased. In other words, they found, in fact, that disproportionately minorities and women were excluded from the interview process, and this was completely uncorrelated with academic record. Now, here's a puzzling thing. St. George's Medical School, in fact, had a reputation for being among the most welcoming to minorities. What else was puzzling? Racial information was not recorded on applications. So there was no way for them to know necessarily the race of an applicant. So how was this happening? What was the algorithm doing? It was using the names of the applicants. If they were foreign sounding, meaning not Anglo-Saxon, they were probably minorities. How did the algorithm come to do this? Because its goal was to match the decisions of the Human Selection Committee. So what the Commission for Racial Equality estimated that roughly 60 female and minority candidates each year did not receive interviews who otherwise might have. Right? This is a substantial number for a school like St. George's. Right? So it illustrates a number of things: good intentions, lack of clarity about what the goal of the algorithm is, and most importantly, and this is what the Commission for Racial Inequality recommended, was that the staff of the medical school could not simply ignore what was happening in the algorithm. It was their responsibility to understand what was happening in the algorithm. And I think this is particularly important. You cannot simply delegate decision making to the algorithm and then say it's the algorithm's fault.
Thank you. So I want to remind you and encourage you, if you have questions, please use this link to text to or raise your hand, and we'd be happy to take a mic around to you at your seat. So I see there's a question here.
Do I need to wait for the mic?
We're recording this, so it would be lovely if you would.
Just to follow up on what you were saying there for a moment, it sort of makes a strong implication that what the board was doing, forget about the algorithm, was also biased, right? I mean, that's sort of an obvious conclusion.
No, you're absolutely right. So the bias here creeps in from the desire to match what the board is doing.
And that could have been going on for...
That could have been going on for years before that, right?
Yeah.
So there's, in some sense, there's a two-edged sword, which is the algorithm could be useful in identifying systematic errors, but then in this case that was not happening. You were simply replacing the humans with the algorithm, and you weren't essentially correcting anything.
So we have a question that was sent in, and so I'm going to read it so that you don't have to crick your neck looking backwards. It says, given that organizations like Facebook and Google are unable to regulate themselves and for obvious reasons are not interested in regulation, shouldn't experts like you figure out how to reel them in? So that's a good question,
So
expert.
I'll take this one to start. I actually have a proposal along those lines on these pieces of paper here. But aside from this specific proposal, so I do think we're entering, I mean, not just in technology, but in many industries, an era in which what I might call algorithmic auditing is going to become a necessity. And part of it isn't just that, you know, maybe commercial companies don't have self-interest in regulating themselves on some of these topics, but I think it's not feasible for humans to kind of keep up with the scale at which algorithmic decision making is being made. So, you know, sort of for better or worse, if you want to regulate the behavior of algorithms, I think you need algorithmic tools as at least part of your arsenal to do that. And you know, things like the study that I mentioned on kind of discrimination in Google search results or advertisements, this is the kind of thing that could be made algorithmic and monitored on an ongoing basis. So you could imagine, for instance, you know, services that basically do controlled experiments over time on an ongoing basis, kind of pinging, you know, services like Facebook and Google, looking for the extent to which there's gender bias or racial bias or other types of discrimination in the results returned by those algorithms. And I think, you know, it's a complicated question what regulatory body should be in control of that kind of activity. I do agree that even though I do think that these companies care about this to some extent, I don't think it's the, you know, it's the right place for it to lie, because you know, you need a certain neutrality. But aside from exactly where it should sit, I think the possibility of these sorts of discrimination indices is now possible in many industries, and we'll probably see it going forward in the future.
So I agree with all of that. One thing I might just add is sort of relating back to the first question is there's really a need, I think, for some basic science to be done here before we really understand how to regulate these things. Because in a lot of the examples, what we've seen is that, you know, things that you can identify after the fact as bias, you know, emerge just from sort of standard machine learning procedures. You can't identify any like malicious actor. And so I think, you know, one thing we need to understand is what are the, you know, frictions out there that are causing, you know, things that we find objectionable to naturally arise when we use machine learning. What are the technical solutions that, you know, forget, yeah, regulation is great, but before we get to the place where we can, you know, call out examples of discriminatory algorithms and ask for them to be fixed, we need to understand how to fix them. Like, what are the, and we need to even understand better what we want. Like, what does it mean for an algorithm to be fair, and how can we arrange for that to be the case. And so some of this basic science is happening here at Penn, but I think there needs to be a lot more of this.
So we have another question here. We talk about big data, but often data we collect is bad. Is there a way to correct for bad data?
So the answer is in some cases yes, but you'd have to be willing to experiment. So let me offer an example that's close to home. It's not so obvious that at Penn we may be very good at selecting people to enter our undergraduate classes. The only way we could really find out is to randomly select a subset of admittees and see how they do. So one advice is if experimentation is relatively inexpensive, you should try experimenting.
Yeah, I mean, I think just in a similar vein, Aaron and I spent the past couple of days at a workshop he organized on all of these topics. And one of the things that was discussed quite a bit are kind of situations in which there are feedback loops between the data that's being gathered, the models that are being learned from that data, and then the redeployment of data gathering mechanisms. So predictive policing is a good example of this. These are systems used by large metropolitan police departments that ingest crime statistics from neighborhoods, build a predictive model of where crime is likely to occur in the next round, and then deploy police forces where they think the hotspots are going to be. And this all sounds like kind of a reasonable idea at a high level, but the problem is that sort of what a statistician would call censoring of data, which is if you put a lot of police somewhere, you're going to catch more crime in that neighborhood, and if you put less police somewhere, you're going to catch less crime there. And if you don't correct for the fact that if you're just greedy with respect to your current estimates, they're going to be self-reinforcing. You're going to see, oh wow, there really was more crime where I sent more police. Now I should send even more police there. And where I sent less police, we caught less crime, so things are okay there. Maybe we can move some of the police somewhere else. And you chuckle, but actually, the systems deployed to do this, I mean, not without controversy, are basically as simple as I described, and they're very prone to these kinds of self-reinforcing feedback loops. And you need to, to kind of fix this scientifically, you need to at least have some component of what Rakesh was saying, which is deliberate experimentation. You need to realize that there's going to be a bias in your data and that you're going to, see more crime where you sent more police, and you need to correct for that in order to reduce the discrimination that you might experience across different neighborhoods.
Yeah, I would just add that these kinds of feedback loops are basically everywhere. Like in a lending application, if my algorithm is deciding who to give loans to, well, I only get data about who ultimately pays back their loans to the people I gave the loans to. In a parole decision application, I only see who actually goes on to commit more crimes to the people I released. So, in all of these settings, you've got these kinds of feedback loops that Michael was talking about. In theory, like in the computer science community, we know how to design machine learning algorithms that can deal with this, but they need to use randomization, experimentation, as Ricky said. So you need to, flip coins and occasionally make decisions that you don't think are optimal, just so you can gather more information. And that's something that I think a lot of algorithms in practice don't do, in part because for other reasons you might, find this kind of experimentation objectionable. If we predict that someone is, pretty likely to go and commit a horrible crime if we release him, but our algorithm says, okay, it's time to flip the coin and maybe release this guy. There are sort of real societal objections to doing things like that. So we need to think about how we can, combine what we know about what machine learning algorithms need to do to gather sensible data from the high stakes applications we want to deploy them in.
Could I just follow up on this?
Sure. There's a mic. Follow-up question.
Just to follow up on the police example, isn't it possible, likely, that in the long term, the feedback loop about more police in a neighborhood could be negative in the sense that it would eventually act as a deterrent to crime, rather than the police catching more crime, as you say?
Well, I'm not quite sure I understand the question. I definitely think that these feedback loops are a bad thing, and not just in the long term. I think they can very quickly kind of get stuck in local minima. in which, you know, they appear to be optimizing with respect to the data that they're gathering, but because they're not accounting for the fact that, you know, of this feedback loop, they're fooling themselves, right? They're not, now I think what you're saying is that by putting more police somewhere, you might actually observe less crime.
Well, you might deter less crime, let's put it that way. So as a result, there's less crime. I mean, that's as biased, though, as the other way. So I mean, it's just that I'm...
Yeah, I guess we can debate whether or not deterrence of crime is a good thing or a bad thing. I tend to think it's a good thing. But yeah, I mean, also when you get into the weeds on this topic, it very much depends on the type of crime one has in mind, right? You know, there's a big difference between how violent crime reacts to the presence of police versus, you know, vice crimes and petty crimes like drug use and things like that, which often take place, for instance, in people's homes, for instance. And so it takes, you know, you don't see it as much on the street in some neighborhoods, even though it might be going on just as much, but just behind closed doors.
So we have another question from the audience. With technology becoming ubiquitous in K-12 education, how should we think about data in that space? What companies or tools are leading the way in making effective use of data to support student learning?
I'm happy to take a crack at it if you guys don't have anything.
What, you're not an expert on K-12 education, guys?
Yeah, maybe K-12 I know less about. Even my kids are almost out of K through 12. But I think generally speaking, certainly at the kind of higher education landscape, I think we're just at the dawn of the era where people are, you know, are like a larger community of people is starting to think seriously about how data could be used in interactive ways to improve, for instance, course design and to personalize courses and the like. I mean, many of you are probably quite familiar with the, you know, MOOC revolution of 5 years back or so, with the advent of these massive online courses. And having taught such a course and used one of those platforms, there is tremendous power in data gathering ability, but as far as I could tell, at least when I was running this course, it was mainly just kind of descriptive statistics so you could know about the demographics and the backgrounds of your students. And that's all incredibly valuable information, especially when you're teaching outside of the confines of an organization like Penn. You know, while there's great diversity in our student body, there's a lot you can count on for your students in the background and knowledge that students arrive at Penn with, just because of the selection process they've been through. Whereas when you do something like an online course on Coursera, you really get people from wildly different backgrounds. And so I think the data is there, but I don't think, at least even at the higher education level yet, I've seen kind of really powerful, widely deployed systems that let instructors, you know, really in a data-driven, seamless way adapt their course offerings for individual students or even different kind of groups of students. So I guess my short answer is it feels like it's still early days. Like, you know, kind of it's like the data gathering capabilities are there, but exactly how to use the data is not settled yet.
So let me take this from the other end, which is there's been a lot of discussion about the use of data to evaluate the performance of teachers, and can we potentially identify the characteristics and behaviors of excellent teachers. On the surface, it seems like we have so much data, surely this would be easy, but it goes back to a point that was made earlier. The answer is no, not unless we're willing to experiment. Randomly assign students to teachers or to schools, track them for 3 or 4 years, do this repeatedly. So since I don't see any school district willing to engage in such large-scale experimentation, whatever data that we collect haphazardly in the way that we currently do is only going to be indicative but not definitive.
And one thing I would say is that, and again, I don't know much about K through 12 education, but I can talk a little bit more about.
You will soon, though.
I will soon. I have a 2-year-old. That. You know, at least at the college level, you know, as we're developing, you know, like a rigorous, you know, scientific and mathematical theory to think about, you know, science, to think about things like fairness and privacy, we can and should start to teach these things to the, undergraduates who are going to go off and be the next generation of Google engineers. So I've taught, a lecture on some of this fairness work we've been doing in our engineering ethics class, and then I've taught a full course on something called differential privacy, which is a, rigorous methodology to do machine learning while respecting privacy. Now that we understand these things, we've got to teach them to the people who are actually going to go out and design these algorithms, and we're at a point when we can.
So we have another question. It changed while you were talking about K-12. With an open, democratic, tolerant society, we want to maintain a plurality of values and often indeterminacy of values so that values may shift and individuals be part of a larger discourse, yet constraints need to be formalized. When are algorithms appropriate for public or government decisions? Yeah, you might want to turn it around. That's a longer one. So I think the last sentence, when are algorithms appropriate for public or government decisions?
That's a big question and a great one. And we had a whole year of discussions and events with the law school about this last year. So one thing, of course, is that algorithms are already being used for important public and government decisions. Who's audited, of course, these algorithms used in sentencing. But I think the first thing to understand is just that there's a temptation to think, okay, well, if an algorithm's making the decision, then clearly it's free of things like bias. So we need to understand. I think there's great potential for algorithms to help in all sorts of decision-making processes because they can combine data in ways humans can't and make more accurate decisions. But until we really understand how these algorithms work, I think it would be a huge mistake to let the algorithms autonomously make decisions. They should be used as tools by human decision makers, and the human decision makers have to be aware of the potential limitations of these algorithms.
On a related note, something that I learned about in this kind of series with the law school that Aaron mentioned is if you look at the regulatory and legal landscape, let's say on the topic of discrimination, and try to apply it to algorithmic decision making, you will essentially massively fail. So, for instance, if you look, for instance, at, I think it's Title IX is the employment law, discrimination in employment law. So there's a very wide body of law on discriminatory, governing discriminatory practices in hiring and promotion decisions and employment decisions. And it's got a lot of case law too. It's not just that there's a lot of laws written, but they've been tested in the courts and precedents have been set. And some colleagues of ours who really are from legal backgrounds rather than technical backgrounds went through the extensive exercise of kind of looking at that body of law and cases and asking the question, well, suppose all these cases were absolutely identical to the way they were in reality, except rather than the discriminatory behaviors being executed by humans and human organizations, you just replace it with an algorithm, okay? And the kind of thought experiment that they did was like, well, could a clever defense lawyer weasel out of the discrimination charges by virtue of the fact that it was algorithmic decision making rather than human decision making? And the upshot was that, in every case, absolutely yes, okay? And you might wonder, like, well, why that is? What would be the, kind of relevant legal arguments that you would, kind of excuse an algorithm from the law? And they're basically what you can kind of imagine. The decision was made as part of a process of data collection in first place, and the data might have been gathered from multiple different sources, okay? So there's the data itself, and there might have been bias already in the data. Then the algorithm was designed by a team of engineers, and maybe they incorporated some existing open source software components. And so the whole process of designing the algorithm was sort of a diffuse social process. And then there's the algorithm's deployment itself, making these decisions. So there's so many places where you can just say, like, well, really there's nobody to blame here, right? The blame is sort of so diffuse. that it becomes very difficult to say, like, no, this was a racist manager, or this was a racist policy by this human organization, and you can kind of point to where it happens. There's this huge, complicated kind of engineering data pipeline, and every little piece of that could have contributed a little bit to the final outcome. And since so much of it might have been out of the control of any one party in this pipeline, you can just kind of raise your hands and say, like, well, nobody's at fault here. And this was a kind of sobering realization for me when I learned about it, because it means that, in sort of regulatory or governmental domains, and also in the private sector, to deal with kind of algorithmic decision making, we're going to need a total rewrite of all of the laws and regulations on these topics.
Quite something.
Which is scary.
Yes, we can take a question from the audience too.
So you guys have been talking about machine learning in the context of social phenomena. We have in the last week the example of the collapsed bridge in Florida and the accident, the Uber automated vehicle killing a person in Arizona. And I'd be interested in hearing what your views are of the differences between analyzing data using machine learning in the social phenomenon environment as opposed to the technical phenomenon environment.
So I would say that, of course, it's difficult to use machine learning in the technical environment, but that's closer to what we, in the technical community sort of understand how to do, and we're always trying to get better at it, but to the extent that you can enunciate like an objective that you would like to maximize, don't hit people, just make sure the bridge doesn't fall down, you can try to optimize that, and we're getting pretty good at it. I don't know exactly what happened with the bridge and whether any machine learning was involved, but certainly the Uber accident can be blamed on a failure of machine learning. So there are, it's not perfect, but we sort of understand the process by which, we can improve these things. I think what's new in the sort of social environment, and by that I mean the setting in which the decisions made by the algorithm, are about people's lives, lending decisions, things like that. Some of the things we care about are different than just the objective that we asked it to optimize. Make as much money as you can giving loans, and that's really new. People really haven't studied to any significant extent yet the side effects that come when you maximize some other objective.
So I would describe the difference this way, which is when I make a prediction about the weather, it doesn't affect what the weather does. So in many physical systems, the data is exogenous. In social systems, when I make a prediction, it affects the data. And so it's this feedback loop that Michael and Aaron have talked about. This is what makes the analysis of this data very difficult, because it's endogenous.
I might also remark that one thing that's special about algorithms and algorithmic decision making is that, for better or worse, you're forced to commit to what behavior you're going to engage in advance in all possible situations in a way that humans aren't forced to do. So let me give, to give one of these parlor game examples in the domain of self-driving cars, right? Some of you might have even seen in mainstream media these little thought puzzles like, okay, you have to design a self-driving car and it's approaching an intersection full of school children and the brakes have failed, and so the car has to make a decision about whether to plow into this group of school children, kind of saving the passenger, or turn the car left into a brick wall, killing the passenger. Okay, what do you do? So while these things kind of seem like, as I said, parlor games, there's the serious element they contain is that if I asked you what you do in that situation, it would be fair for you to say, like, I don't know, or you might make a commitment, but of course, in reality, you just react at the moment and do something, and it would be one or the other, let's say. But when you write an algorithm, there's an opportunity for you to say in advance what you're, not just an opportunity, but you cannot avoid it, right? Because you're writing down code. And when that code is faced with the particular situation that I described, it's going to do something that's a direct result of the code that you're writing now. So you're pre-committing to your kind of output on all possible inputs. And I think that's kind of a situation that we've never been in before in situations, for instance, like driving, right? And so there's a big moral opportunity that comes with it, and also a big moral responsibility. And in other words, you kind of have to think about these questions to some extent, because if you don't, you're going to write some program anyway that's going to make this decision at the moment it needs to, and you're kind of on the hook for its behavior even though you wrote that algorithm before. And I think that this, has blessings and curses to it that we only dimly have a handle on at this point.
Yeah, so I think, when we're talking about things like fairness and other considerations in algorithms, all of these things apply just as well to human decision makers. But to some extent, like thus far in society, while we've been having humans making important decisions, we've been able to avoid needing to think precisely about these issues, basically for the reasons that Michael said, that human beings, first, they don't have to pre-commit to what they would do in every situation, and also, even after decisions have been made, they're very good at ex post justifying why they made a decision, even if that ex post justification isn't really why they made it. When we've got an algorithm, we've got the ability to ask all sorts of counterfactual questions, like what would the algorithm have done if this part of the situation was slightly different. These are questions that we can't. We can try to ask them to human decision makers, but there's no reason to think that the answers we get, even if they sound convincing, are what really would have happened. And this both allows us to think about issues of moral issues, like do you plow into the school children or kill the driver, fairness issues in a precise way, which is a good thing, but also makes it unavoidable that we have to think about these things because you're explicitly grappling with them whenever you write down the algorithm.
So we are pretty much out of time, but there's one last question up here. There's another question in the back. I'd like to answer this question very briefly. In your ideal scenario, how would AI affect buying and selling goods and services 20 years from now? Perhaps just one of you would take that, then we'll quickly take the...
So I think I can answer that one very quickly.
Rakesh.
You're going to have software agents that will negotiate on your behalf.
Okay. That's an answer. You mean I don't have to go buy a car?
No.
Of course, we told you that 20 years ago also. But
One last question, please.
Yes. Brief comment, actually. I'm an old trial lawyer. About the cars and what happened yesterday, and I think your whole field has to be aware of this. I also taught high school. Humans want to blame it on that car. They want to do that. That's the uphill battle you have in convincing people that all this stuff is doable. And in fact, it looks like that woman may have stepped right out in front of that car in the dark, and probably most humans would have run over her. Just a thought.
Well, on that happy note, I'd like to thank all of you very much for coming today and for the excellent questions. I'd like to thank our panelists for their thoughtful comments. Thank you so much.